Well, thank you so much for being here this afternoon. My name is Shirin Bakhshay, and I'm a PhD candidate in the psychology department. My research is interested in leveraging psychological theory and data to improve criminal justice processes. I have a background in criminal law, and so I'm going to talk to you today about my current research, Satisfying the Urge to Punish, exploring strategies for increasing support for restorative justice practices. And by way of a little context, we are living in the era of mass incarceration. It's a well-known fact and something that there's no sort of bipartisan disagreement about. What that means is that we incarcerate more people in this country at a higher rate and for longer periods of time than any other country in the world. So the United States has approximately 5% of the world's total population, but 25% of their prisoners. There's currently about 2.1 million people in prisons and jails in this country, and that does not include people who are on parole or who have probation status or anything like that. This represents a 600% increase since the early 70s, when there was a rapid change in sentencing policy and law, as well as the politicization of criminal justice issues, where you had politicians really leveraging criminal justice issues in their political campaigns and using a lot of tough on crime rhetoric. And so acknowledging that this is a harmful situation that we're in, it's harmful for the people who are incarcerated. There's well-documented negative impacts of incarceration, as well as negative social impacts, economic impacts. It also doesn't reduce crime. It doesn't reduce recidivism. We need to rethink the way that we punish in this country. So that's why restorative justice represents a viable, promising alternative, because it's both a different process and a different meaning of justice, one that is not focused on punishment per se, but is more focused on repairing harm and restoring people. So really attending to the victim's needs as well. People do not go through traditional criminal justice processes, something you might be familiar with as going to a trial, getting sentenced by a judge, and then doing time in prison. Instead, they're diverted to a system where they have to confront the victims, the communities or the families of the victims, take responsibility for their actions, talk about their motivations, hear from the victim as well, and then ultimately come up with a plan for how am I going to make this right? How am I going to make you whole? So there's a lot of different elements that are not present in the criminal justice system that currently is most predominantly used, where the victim really gets a say in what happens and the victim gets to, feel more of a sense of closure. This brings me to the title of my presentation, which is Satisfying the Urge to Punish. The reason why this is so important, not just because it has better documented outcomes, there's lower recidivism rates for people who go through restorative justice processes, and victims feel higher senses of satisfaction. There's also this emotional component to restorative justice that can meet our urge to punish. And what I mean by that is there is a lot of psychological literature that documents that we have a deeply ingrained need to see justice done. And by that we mean, retributive urge to punish people who we see as having committed wrongdoing. It's important to acknowledge that punishment doesn't just serve a public safety function. It serves a symbolic, social, and psychological function. It reaffirms those of us who are law-abiding in the right. It's got a validating, soothing function, and it can ease anxiety not just about crime, but about other social ills. And oftentimes our instrumental concerns around safety and risk mask that symbolic need for feeling that, there's been some consequence for this wrongdoing. So taking these things together, what my research is really interested in doing is sort of saying, knowing that there's this urge to punish, how can we satisfy that punitive urge while still engaging in this sort of transformational reform using restorative justice that many people don't see as a form of punishment at all? How can we get the public on board with something that feels so starkly different from what we've been doing for the last century? So what I have done is a number of focus group studies with community members trying to understand what they know about restorative justice, what they think about justice in general, and specifically, what are their barriers to support for restorative justice, what would increase their support, and ultimately, can restorative justice satisfy their need for punishment? And what my research has found is that restorative justice is not considered punitive, and therefore it's seen as ineffective. So it's thought of as therapy. It's a form of therapy, it's a good thing, but it doesn't replace punishment. It doesn't meet our symbolic need for safety. So one comment I got a lot was, I'm sorry to say, but how will this keep my kids safe? And then related to that is the idea that criminals are these dehumanized others, these sort of worst of the worst people. So what about sociopaths, you know, Charles Manson types? People brought up Charles Manson, which is a very old crime and not representative of crime in general in every single focus group that I conducted, which tells you something about the way that we view crime as a society. So given this, what are some strategies for increasing support? The first is really focusing on education, not just that restorative justice is out there and that it works, but how it works, really focusing on the details of what goes into the process so people understand that it is really difficult and it is more punitive to come face to face with someone. Focusing on social empathy and understanding people's circumstances, what the fundamental root causes of crime are to kind of disrupt some of that othering. So again, a telling comment, who are these people? I mean, who is it we're just gonna let run around? And the answer is they're community members. They're you know, people who live in our society, who are part and parcel of our communities, and to kind of reframe that. And then importantly, to rethink the way that restorative justice is framed. So right now it's really seen as this sort of utopian vision, kind of pie in the sky ideal, but it's actually something that we currently use in a number of jurisdictions. So again, back and forth, maybe you should rebrand it as restorative punishment. And then somebody else said, that would make me feel better, even though I followed up and said, but if nothing else changed. And she said, yeah, just the label itself. So really focusing on publicizing restorative justice as an existing option among a current set of punishments that we already use. And again, focusing on that emotional expressive aspect of restorative justice. And I realize that time is short, and so I'm going to end here, and I'll take any questions that you may have or any questions about the next steps with this research and where I hope to go with it. I'd be more than happy to answer.